Hello, Holy Trinity, and welcome to this next podcast. If anyone is watching this and you might be just visiting our podcast, my name is Jitesh. I'm one of the ministers here at Holy Trinity. It's my joy to just share a brief word of encouragement for us in these few minutes. And I believe that the Lord's really given me a word to help us to understand what He is doing in some of our lives in this present season. And it's a word based out of a single verse from Deuteronomy 8, verse 3, and I'm going to read it for us. Moses, speaking to Israel, says this: "And he humbled you and let you hunger and fed you with manna which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord." It's a verse that many of us will perhaps know. And it's spoken to the wilderness generation who are looking back, and Moses is explaining what God was doing during the 40 years in the wilderness, preparing them for life ahead, taking and possessing the promised land which they're on the edge of. And we know that they could have been ready 40 years previously, but God had to do something unique and special in that set apart time, those wilderness years of 40 years. To make them ready for the season of blessing ahead that he wanted them to give, to obtain, for them to inhabit for the future. Because if they weren't ready for it, it'd be a dangerous time. That if he was to give them the promised land before they were ready for it, it would have led to disaster. We know that the previous generation had got it wrong, that they had acted in rebellion against God's promises and shown that they weren't ready. And it's often been said about them that they'd been taken out of Egypt, but Egypt hadn't been taken out of them. And so we learn here how God had made this generation, the wilderness generation, ready for the season of blessing, for the season of purpose and identity, for the season that was really tailor-made for them, that he wanted and he longed to give to them, but not before they were ready for it. And I think for many of us in this period, I have a sense that the Lord is doing something very similar and very akin to that wilderness period. That he's led us into a very special and unusual period set apart that's tough, just like that wilderness time was tough. But it's preparing us for a season of blessing ahead. It's preparing us for something that he's always wanted to give to us. But if he gave it to us before we were ready for it, it'd be a dangerous thing for him to give. And in this time, we're called to join in with what he's doing in preparing us and changing us, make us fit and ready to receive the time ahead. And I just want to dig out of that single verse 3 things that he's doing perhaps in some of our lives. And the first thing is from the very beginning of that verse where it says, he humbled you and let you hunger. And that's what he's doing in our lives. That for Israel, they were taken away from ready provision of food in the desert, and they had no sense of their own power in the face of it. They were stripped of pride, of self-sufficiency, and they learned what it was to hunger for the things they used to depend on. Hunger in a way that they couldn't satisfy their own needs in the way that they used to. And for us in the face of this current pandemic and shutdown, I think God is using it to humble us. He's using it, of course, to humble a nation to its knees to seek the Lord. But I think for those of us that do know him, he's using it to humble us, to depend on him, to realize that actually despite our great self-sufficiency, our ability that we have to generate sustenance and life for ourselves, and the pride that we can have in that sometimes, that when push comes to shove in the face of things like this, in the end, we've got nothing that we bring to the table. That in the end, we face hunger. That in the end, we can't generate life for ourselves and provision for ourselves. And that we're humbled and made to hunger and to look to someone else for that. And I think that in this season, it may well be that you face a stripping time where things you used to rely on have been taken away and you miss them and you long for them Especially a few weeks into shutdown, you're especially just beginning to feel the longing for things that you used to have in life, that used to sustain you, that used to energize you, that used to keep you going. I want you to recognize that in this season, in God's sovereignty, it may well be that He is taking that from you through these circumstances in order to humble and make us hungry. Because then the second thing that verse says is that He fed Israel with manna. It says, and fed you with manna which you did not know, nor did your fathers know. That in that context, simultaneously, God fed Israel with manna, that mysterious, unknown bread-like substance that they gathered day by day, enough for each day, teaching them to rely on the supernatural provision of God, that He would provide in a unique and unusual way that they'd never experienced, nor their fathers, but they'd know it's from Him, that supernatural provision. And I suggest, I think God really wants to do that in our lives in this season, to display His power to supernaturally provide for us day by day. Not an abundance and overflow so that it just covers the entire period, because that would make us not dependent on Him anymore, but day by day, enough for each day, supernaturally providing means and grace to keep us going. And by doing that, we'll become aware of just how faithful He is. We become aware of His power, and we become aware that actually all provision in the end is from Him for life. Because the end of that verse says that He does this so that He might make us know that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. And I think in the season ahead, God is going to give many of us great abundance, richer blessings, in both physical senses and spiritual senses than we've had in the past. A real promised land to enter into. But the key lesson that we need to learn ahead of that is that He is the one who is the faithful provider of all of it. That everything that we have, every single ounce of provision, hasn't come from physically generated abilities that we have, but by the commanded blessing of God day by day, the word of His mouth that He commands into being in our lives on a daily basis. And we need to know that and live in light of it and recognize it so that we're kept safe and able to receive the fullness of what God wants to give. And I think some of us will just start to, over these days, see that supernatural provision and be in wonder and just say, Lord, of course that's You, that You've just provided the most amazing way that I've never seen before. And I'm learning this lesson so well. And that this lesson is one that's going to stay with me. We know that for Jesus, at the end of His time in the wilderness, when the devil tempted Him to create bread out of stone, He replied with this very verse, that He knew that He didn't need to generate provision for Himself, but He could trust God, every word that proceeds from His mouth, and that He'd recognize in the time to come that everything that happened was God. It wasn't Him, it was God doing it, providing and leading and giving life and blessing Himself and blessing many through Him. And for us, can I encourage us to join in with this lesson that God, I think, is teaching many of us in this season? Well, thanks so much for listening.